Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vagan Radian here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies to talk to Todd Harrison, a man who does all manner of budget as well as space work here at CSIS, a frequent contributor to our podcast, the Defense and Aerospace Business Report, and one of the three authors of Space Threat Assessment 2018 by Todd Harrison, Caitlin Johnson, and Tom Roberts. And General Keeler did illustrious U.S. Air Force Space General Officer who was also both at Space Command but also U.S. Strategic Command. Just a real thinker on this issue. Todd, give us a little bit of an update. What's the message you were trying to deliver? And full disclosure, Aerospace Industries Association was the sponsor of this report.
Yes, so absolutely, and we were very thankful to General Kaler for writing a foreword for our report. What motivated this report is that all of the discussion going on about the need to reorganize space within the Air Force or within DoD and the need to build more resilient space systems, it's fundamentally predicated on a threat that we see emerging from other countries to challenge us in space and to hold our space assets at risk. And what we wanted to do is address that and get more information out there, aggregate information so that people could better understand the threats we're facing as a nation. Now, the challenge here is, of course, we're publishing an unclassified report. So we're just using open source available information on what other countries are doing in space.
And what are I was looking for you to, I thought you were going to take that one extra step, so I decided to have that awkward pause. So what are look, there's been a lot of discussion about the sort of threats the United States and its assets face in space, whether it's laser measures, electronic measures, jamming measures. The Russians pride themselves on a whole variety of possible effects they can deliver that are non-kinetic, and then there's the whole kinetic space as well. Walk us through the full panoply of what those threats look like, because and then I want to get you into these dueling visions that nobody will have war in space because it would be bad for everybody, including the person who starts it, which historically hasn't dissuaded people from doing stupid things.
Yeah, so in our report, we divided the different types of space threats into four categories. So the first are the kinetic physical forms of attack. That's what most people think of when they think of counter space weapons. So like a direct ascent ASAT weapon that goes up and strikes a satellite in orbit, creates a huge cloud of debris. Also co-orbital ASAT threats. So a satellite that you could put into orbit and then later maneuver it to strike or otherwise damage or interfere with another satellite.
Or be on an intersecting orbit, which is what some of the threats have been also.
Yes. And now, that's just one type of threat, though, the kinetic physical. We also looked at the non-kinetic physical types of threats. So these are things where they can have physical effects on your satellite without directly touching it, such as a high-power laser that could cause components to overheat or damage optics within an imaging satellite, or a high-power microwave weapon that could be used to damage circuits or cause computer chips to reset on a satellite. Then we also looked at electronic forms of attack. So here we're thinking about jamming and spoofing of the signals coming to and from satellites. If you can disrupt those signals, you could degrade the operation of the satellite substantially. And the final category of threats we looked at are cyber threats. So really this is attacking the data that goes through satellites. And in particular, if you can get into the command and control uplink to a satellite through a cyber attack, you could effectively take control of the satellite and disable or destroy it through those means. So those are the different types of threats we looked at. Then we looked at on a country-by-country basis, and we focused on the four main countries that are listed in the National Defense Strategy. So Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. And then we also had another section where we looked at other partners and allies in the United States and even non-state actors and what they're doing to develop counter space weapons.
And talk to us a little bit about what each of the individual threat nations is doing, but as well as that other group, which is a fascinating way of looking at it because there is a lot of resident capability there that is a little bit maybe more hybrid in nature than most people want to think about?
Yeah, so Russia, of course, has been a major space power really since the beginning of the space age. They were the first ones to put a man-made object in orbit.
There was
And
that Sputnik
that
thing, right?
Sputnik thing, yeah. And a lot of people forget that, space was contested from the beginning as well. The first anti-satellite test was in 1959. And by the way, it was a U.S. test. But the Soviets at that time, of course, were developing counter space weapons all along. Mainly, they seemed to focus initially on co-orbital ASAT weapons. So Russia today, they have all that legacy capability from the Soviets that they are trying to re-energize and bring back. And they really pose a threat across the full spectrum, all the different types of threats that we talked about before. Russia has those kind of capabilities. They are trying to bring them back, update them, and use them. And you even see Russia today in Syria and Ukraine, we see widespread use of SATCOM jamming and GPS jamming already. So this is happening on a day-to-day basis. Now, China, they are a rising space power. They are catching up in many ways. And so they are building out more and more sophisticated counter space weapons. And again, they go across the full spectrum of threats, and, including, direct ascent ASAT weapons, which they tested to, great acknowledgement in 2007. But they've continued to test these direct ascent ASAT weapons since then. It looks like they're working on co-orbital ASAT capabilities, or could be developing dual-use technologies for that. Of course, they are, very capable in jamming, lasing satellites, and of course, cyber attacks. Now, Iran and North Korea are really in a different league. They're more rogue nations. They don't have the more sophisticated technology for direct ascent ASAT weapons, or even the non-kinetic physical threats, like lasing a satellite. What we see from Iran and North Korea is they're focusing on electronic attack and cyber attack. And both countries are using jamming systems routinely now. To interfere with both, military and commercial systems. So, we see a lot of different threats emerging from different countries. Now, what I found particularly interesting in this study is what we saw non-state actors are doing. And you don't typically think of non-state actors as, engaging in warfare in space, but they are already. We already have documented examples of, in Iraq, we experienced jamming of our military communication links that were going through commercial satellites. Those were being jammed by insurgent groups in Iraq in the early days of the conflict there. We've also seen that jihadists in Pakistan have been developing things like GPS jammers. And, if people don't think of this as a space weapon, well, they need to back up and reconsider what a space weapon is. If it denies us the use of that asset on orbit, and it denies us that military advantage that space provides, it is countering our space systems. It is a space weapon. And these attacks, people like to say, oh, warfare in space will never happen. It's already happening.
Right. So pretty much everything is a space weapon, right? And ultimately, because almost all of our systems depend on those networks for communication, connectivity, and the whole mix. In terms of, and you answered that question, right? Because folks have been saying a war in space is the worst thing. We have, an interview after interview that comes up. Head of U.S. Strategic Command, a man who is a space warrior in his own right, has discussed that a couple of times. That nobody wants to go there, but it's very, very prudent for us to consider what that looks like. So as you guys have looked at the threat, what does that look like? How much of a deterrent posture is possible at this point? Because it's true that even the Chinese are suffering from the debris from their ASAT test to a degree. Folks are going to have to maneuver around it. It's at an altitude where it's not going to decay, and it's going to be up there for a very, very long time. Right. I remember years ago, folks worried about the terror weapon of a ton of sand spread in Leo, and the kind of, that permanently denies everybody space. So it's possible that there could be some power who does look at it that way as a total zero-sum game. Talk to us about how to be thinking about deterrence in space to both protect those assets, hold things at risk. What's the right approach in order to have our adversaries go in a direction we'd rather them go than a direction we'd rather they not?
Yeah, no, I would agree with the assessment that a kinetic conflict in space is not that likely. Now, we have to be prepared for it and we have to work to deter against it, but it's not that likely because the countries that could really carry that out, Russia and China, they have a lot to lose in space as well. And as they build out their own military space systems, they will have even more at stake in space. So they don't want to create huge debris fields either. But that doesn't mean they won't attack our space systems in other ways. And so that's why I think what we ought to be prioritizing, what we ought to be thinking about most carefully, are the forms of attack in space that are most useful to our adversaries, that they may feel more at ease to use, they may think that these actions like jamming, lasing, cyber attacks, they may think that they're below threshold, that it won't escalate conflict with us, that they can even do some of these things prior to the initiation of conflict on the ground. That's what I worry about. I worry about how do we deter these forms of attack, and many of which are reversible, and where attribution can be difficult or delayed. So I think we've really got to work on that question. How do we deter those things? And a large part of it, I think, is first of all increasing our space situational awareness capabilities. We can always do better, and especially to be able to map the RF spectrum in space and determine who's jamming and where is it coming from in real time. But also, I think we've got to do better in disclosing some of our capabilities to other countries, because they're not going to be deterred by something that they don't know exists. And so we've got to selectively let other countries know we can see you, we can see what you're doing, we have the ability to respond, we have the ability to negate what you're doing. At the right time and the right place, we've got to let other countries know that, or else they'll never be deterred by our capabilities.
And I should have mentioned General Hyten's name earlier when we were talking, because I realized I said all of that and I hadn't mentioned his name. General Hyten, so about the disclosure of capability and space situational awareness, which is what you're talking about. General Hyten raised eyebrows by sort of framing, when he was Air Force Space Command commander, what some of the challenges and issues were, and folks were like, whoa, and he was kind of getting out there about the vulnerability of these assets, whereas part of it was to create that sense of urgency that we need to be doing stuff here. When I remember sort of about 10 years ago or so, when I was writing about lasing or intersecting orbits or co-orbital capabilities that existed up there, a big focus was on the investment in space situational awareness. And there are some of the most highly classified systems we have are in that part of the business. Do we have enough situational awareness on what's going on? And what's the right way to disclose some of these capabilities? Because this has been an ongoing debate and discussion. I know that President Obama, in a certain select cases, revealed to our adversaries capabilities that were a real brushback pitch to sort of be like, hey, we're doing these things, and that's just the tip of an iceberg, so you better knock that stuff off. How effective is that likely to be? So space situational awareness, but also how effective that's likely to be, or just disclosing to an adversary, hey, this is another problem set we have to solve?
I mean, in terms of space situational awareness capabilities, I think you can never have too much. And it's a strategic advantage if you've got significantly better situational awareness than your adversary does. You want to be able to know more than they know about the environment that's up there. And that's an area where, we're doing things like Space Fence is going to be coming online soon. So we're going to have better tracking of even smaller objects in orbit, but we can always do more. And in terms of disclosure, how and when do you disclose things to your adversaries? I think a great example is when General Hyten revealed the fact that we have these GSAP satellites that are in the geostationary belt. And their object is to go, their mission is to go around and inspect and look at other items that are up there, and they can get, closer than you can from Earth. I think that was a great disclosure, because that let our adversaries know whatever they're trying to do in geosynchronous orbit, any kind of orbital satellites, any tests that they're doing, we're watching. We have the capability to watch. What I would love to see is the next time we see Russia or China do something up there that's highly suspicious, like maneuvering, taking something that initially is cataloged as a piece of debris from a launch, and then all of a sudden that piece of debris starts to maneuver and it nuzzles up close to some other satellite. I'd like to see a GSAP satellite come by and snap a picture and let's release it, right? Let's show the world, what they're doing. Now, yeah, you can dumb down things like resolution. You don't have to give away all the capabilities of it. But I think that would be a powerful message to send to others that we're watching and we're not afraid to show other people. This was done to great effect, I think, in crises like the Cuban Missile Crisis, to take some of those classified photos of missiles and show the world, show people what we're talking about. Really call out the bad actors for what they're doing.
Have your own Adlai Stevenson moment.
Yes.
I want to go to House Space. You've advocated for the Space Corps. That has percolated in the debate. It doesn't look like it's proceeding, but the House is still very focused on a Space Command. Talk to us a little bit about the discussion there, where we're likely to get, because the administration has shown at least some openness to some of the congressional ideas. We saw it Indo-Pacific Command. It's not U.S. Pacific Command anymore, but Indo-Pacific Command, obviously acknowledging a very important region that plays into Pacific Command's AOR. Talk to us a little bit about the Space Command language and update us on where we are on the Space Corps idea, which, the administration and the Air Force is still resisting.
Yeah, well, so, we used to have a U.S. Space Command. It wasn't that long ago. I believe it was under Rumsfeld's leadership of the Pentagon that they got rid of, separate U.S. Space Command, and it became subordinate under U.S. Strategic Command. What they're talking about now is elevating it back up, basically on par with where Cyber Command is now. And so I think that there's a pretty good chance that goes forward, even because the Air Force itself has already been working to elevate space within STRATCOM. So I can see something like that moving forward this year, perhaps through legislation, or perhaps the Air Force would want to start moving on their own to do this. In terms of the Space Corps, what's interesting is that President Trump has come out now twice and said that he supports the idea of creating a Space Force. Now, semantics, right? Space Corps, Space Force. Well, typically a Space Force is going to mean a whole independent service and department, so totally separate from the Air Force. The Space Corps that the House has put forward last year, and that they're still championing, in future years, a Space Corps would still be an independent service, but part of the Department of the Air Force, and still under the Secretary of the Air Force. But it would have a separate Chief of Staff. It would be very much like the Marine Corps is to the Department of the Navy. So what President Trump is talking about actually goes further than what the House put in the bill last year. So, this debate is not dead. It's not going away. I think, the more the Air Force digs in their heels on it, the more the House is going to push this. And over time, I think eventually we're going to get to something like this. Now, what's pending right now, 2 studies. One study was mandated by last year's NDAA, and it's being conducted by Deputy Secretary Shanahan himself about how they're going to reorganize internally and do space acquisitions better. And that one, I believe, is due in August. There's also a separate study that was mandated by the NDAA that had to go to an independent FFRDC. That went to the Center for Naval Analysis because it required that it be an FFRDC that's not closely affiliated with Air Force. So they went to CNA. That study is due by the end of December this year. That study, it was mandated that it's not going to study whether or not we should create a Space Corps. It's going to develop a roadmap for how to create an independent service, an independent department for military space. So that is intended to inform next year's NDAA, the FY20 NDAA.
And clearly, this is something that the Air Force is going to win the way that it's playing it. We'll keep following that. Now, your time is short, and I just have to ask you about this really, really cool model. You were talking about sizes of boosters earlier. This one is pretty much the biggest one, with 7.6 million pounds from 4 F1 engines. Yep. It's by Lego or Lego, if you want to go totally Danish on it. You got to tell us about this, man. It is so cool. It has talk to us about the instruction book as well, yep. And that this was a great team building exercise for you and your team. Yeah. So tell us about this awesome Saturn V model.
when we were out at the Space Symposium in Colorado Springs in April, my team and I were walking through the different exhibition booths, and one of the booths had one of these models, and they were doing a raffle. And we were like, oh, that'd be so great. Now, of course, we didn't win the raffle. And then a few weeks later, I was at a toy store with my kids, and I looked on the shelf. I'm like, there it is. I got to get it. So I got it, and then we decided we would build it together as a team. So we did that last night here. Over pizza and beer and watching the movie The Right Stuff. Turns out that it took about 5 of us the exact runtime of The Right Stuff to build this. And in terms of the instructions here, well, it's thicker than our space threat assessment report. 200 pages.
And far more riveting. No, I'm just joking.
Maybe. But 200 pages of instructions here to put it all together. It's pretty incredible.
Well, and also show us the picture of the designers of it. I mean, this is actually really cool because they're not Lego guys, right? They're space enthusiasts.
These are guys that went and designed this on their own, and they convinced Lego to build it. And now it's become a pretty popular kit. And my favorite part of it is you can actually still take it apart and show the different stages. We'll put that back together in a minute. But you can see the first stage, the second stage. Pretty cool stuff.
And if I may pick it up, you've got here the S4B stage is right there.
There we go.
And well, you need okay. Yeah. And then you've also got a little lunar lander. Not only is it that, but hang on a second. The legs extend. I mean, how cool is that? But everybody's got to step very carefully here because near your feet there are some pieces, and then there's the okay. Well, here I got part of the
cut this out.
escape. No. Let's keep this in for God's sakes. Oh, and one of your thruster packs is missing. But that's really cool. Now, have they said at all whether or not there's going to be sort of a Titan Gemini or a Redstone or even a Vostok? Wouldn't that be cool to be able to put it next to it?
Yeah, that I don't know, but if they'll make them, at least all the U.S. launch vehicles, I'll buy them and build them.
Now, one other thing about your great art gallery as we step over here. Todd's got a really cool office here at CSIS, as you can tell, with a beautiful marble stone wall thing, which is quite lovely. But you also have an awesome art exhibit. So you've got the requisite rocket pictures, which is great. But your kids did these 2 awesome little drawings. But they're also tell us a little bit about what each of them mean, because they're very, very relevant to the budget debate, aren't they, Todd?
Absolutely. Well, my kids didn't come up with names for them. So my daughter, Rebecca, who's 5, she'll be going into kindergarten soon. Her picture, she didn't have a name for it. And so I looked at it and I said, that reminds me a lot of sequestration. Right. Because it's just a complete mess. It's just lots of scribble, like things are going all over the place. You can't really make sense of, what's really happening there. So I think she was inspired by sequestration. And she was born, actually, within a few days of when the sequestration order was initially supposed to be issued. So, I thought about possibly naming her Sequestria, but I didn't even raise that with my wife. I didn't think that would go over.
She's both lovely and highly patient, as we know. And also, I love the allegorical darkness at the center of that. And now the other one. Talk to us about what we're looking at here, because she's also very, very talented.
Yeah, so that's my older daughter, Sarah. She's 9. She'll be going into 4th grade now. And so, this picture, you may think at first that it's a couple of sunflowers, but you'd be wrong. Really, it represents the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018, because you see that the pie is getting larger. You've increased, especially on the defense side. The defense part of the budget caps has gotten much larger. And so that's really what is depicted here. And there's a lot more order and stability in this picture, especially when compared to the sequestration picture.
Yes, if only they could be running the budget process. And the other piece of that could be the size of the defense increase with the rest of the federal budget increase, which was much smaller.
That's right. So defense really won on this. And so the pie is growing.
Todd Harrison of CSIS, it's always a treat to come by your office. Thank you very, very much. And we will help you reassemble your rocket. We lost the fairing there, but thanks very much again for all of this. And everybody should check out the Space Report. It's really, really cool. And it's also a little bit of a different layout than normally we see with most of the CSIS reports, but it's really, really packed with a lot of fascinating information. So I was just giving you a hard time earlier about, the instruction book being more interesting.
Yeah, well, the instruction book was actually pretty interesting. And we got through 200 pages pretty quickly.
Thanks very much again, Todd.
All right, thank you.